The fight. Melt ice. So, I was able to, these folks, we have the co-founder of United We Dream, who's Cristina, I'm going to mangle this, Cristina Jimenez Moreta, Ecuadorian immigration activist. This is written by her and Cynthia Garcia, who is... I actually struggled on this one because that's such a common name. And her name was kind of overruled by this other individual who has nothing to do with it, who's like a life coach. If somebody has information on Cynthia Garcia, I would love to know more about her. But United We Dream is a good organization. They are a immigration activist type of program. They championed and got, like, their efforts had a large hand in getting DACA set up during the Obama administration. They fight for immigrant rights and changes to our completely broken immigration program. If you are interested in reading, looking into their website and some of the work that they do, that's their website. So yeah. Anyway, why we're fighting for a world without ICE. Under the cover of post-9/11 anti-terrorism, the Department of Homeland Security has unleashed a carceral assault on immigrant families and children. By Cristina, Jimenez, Moreta, and Cynthia Garcia. Immigrant youth and our families courageously left everything behind in our countries of origin to move to the United States. Some of us fled poverty, military coups, violence and wars, while others simply wanted to go after a better life. While adapting to a new place, we've experienced some of the worst this country has to offer. Workplace exploitation, wage theft, racial profiling, fear of deportation, and police violence. But as part of the immigrant youth movement at United We Dream, we also experienced the power of people coming together, taking action, and winning change. The seeds of our movement began with the idea that we have to protect and defend our families from deportation and fight for our right to access higher education. In the early 2000s, tens of thousands of undocumented students were graduating from high school each year. All of us lived with the fear of deportation and the looming possibility that our families could be torn apart, while simultaneously facing barriers to college education, exploitation at work, and a future filled with uncertainty. This fear of deportation was heightened after September 11, 2001, as we witnessed how immigration enforcement and national security were being conflated in new and troubling ways. In the name of fighting terrorism, President George W. Bush created the Department of Homeland Security, 2002, within which immigration and immigrants were considered matters of national security. This not only led to increased racial profiling and xenophobia, but as a result, local and federal law enforcement were targeting Muslims, Black immigrants, and non-Muslim immigrants of color at higher rates, often leading to detention and/or deportation. So, I'm going to pause there. Immigration. The idea of undocumented immigrants. Like, I want to return to that just to put this in context because, yeah, in the early 2000s, tens of thousands were going through the high school system each year. What is an undocumented immigrant? Why does that status exist here? And that really is, it's a failing of having an effective and accessible immigration route to would-be immigrants. Most of those are visa overstays. Like, an overwhelming majority of them are just visa overstays. They came here on a work visa and just didn't go back. A lot of that's because, I mean, the reality of it is because we have these immigration caps. And we have a completely busted immigration court system. This is not a new problem. Like, all of the biannual fear about the immigrant caravans, we've always had immigration in the country, whether it's by caravan or by boat or by plane. People want to move here. And, you know, it's fine, really. Like, we have more than enough land. We have more than enough resources to accommodate immigrants, and in fact do. But all of the incentives are wrong. There is continued financial incentive to make immigration very difficult. If you have undocumented immigrants living in this country in large numbers, we have 4% of our population being undocumented immigrants, that means they can be used for extremely cheap labor. And anytime you want to get rid of them, for whatever reason, you just can. Yeah, exactly, Homesteader. 28 years to get status as a citizen. It's absurd. That's most of a lifetime. Like, as far as your actual, like, I don't want to say best years, but like nearly 30 years is a huge chunk of your life just to relocate legally. On the flip side, if you happen to be moneyed and white, you can just move here. I fundamentally disagree with that whole meritocracy argument, because that's what it's aimed for, is legitimizing just having rich, educated, high-skilled workers moving here. But, like, what is that? What is the point of that exactly? We have enough low skill. I'm using terminology that exists. I recognize that no labor is, actual low skill. But for purposes of conversation, I'm invoking that language. But, like, those jobs exist. We clearly have need for it because companies do use our undocumented immigrant population extensively to get shit done. But they can get it done cheaper as long as these people are kind of off the books. And therein is a lot of the reason why a fair bit of corporate America likes to have a large undocumented population. It's not even that we don't necessarily want immigrants here. Corporate America wants them here. They just want them in a position where they are at their mercy. And the work visa thing. So There was even a case, I worked with someone who was a white immigrant from Canada, and even they had to work for well over a decade, where every year they did not know and were constantly in fear of deportation, and she set herself back financially a massive amount because she was terrified of actually buying a home, because she didn't know if she'd just be kicked out. So why buy a home? So, you know, she had a decade of that she could have been paying on a mortgage where she did not, where she was renting. Yeah, and I'm not saying like I'm not saying that there's, you know, a bunch of capitalists in a dark room like smoking cigars and saying, let's extort the immigrants, but there is that financial incentive. And I try to be aware of those things. Like, I try and really scrutinize systems, and I've started doing this from a gamesmanship perspective. Like, if I wanted to game the system, what would I do? And that can be very informative. If I were a company owner and I wanted to maximize profits and minimize expenses, this is a way that you can do it. And you know, corporations and systems are big enough that no one individual is doing it. But yeah, you do have to be aware of those inherent biases, because they play into these sorts of things, and they can be very informative about why systems develop the way that they do. And if you are a hyper-capitalist nation, this is a good way to increase profit margin. This bears out historically as well. If you go far enough back to like Chinese immigrants who were brought in to help out with mining, which is shit work. You know, it was very dangerous work, and they were treated as expendable. But they were starting to, you know, show up in too many numbers. So that's when we started getting the immigration caps. And the numbers of immigrants didn't really slow down. But that's when we started having what we consider undocumented immigrants. It goes into the mid and early 1800s. From what I could read, that's as far back as it goes. And it did have that financial incentive back then as well. It wasn't purely xenophobic. There's actually a fiscal reason to do it. Doesn't justify it, but I try to understand them. So anyway, and yeah, it helps prevent them from becoming homeowners, which, as we've seen from how the black community is treated, is a big part of how capital keeps control in white hands, by restricting who actually gets access to housing. If you can keep immigrants, you know, on the hook for decades, you can prevent them from putting down roots. Let me continue reading. I get tangential sometimes. Apologies. Nationwide, thousands would be implicated by the post-9/11 enforcement regime, which produced an expanding infrastructure that supported local and federal law enforcement efforts to criminalize, target, detain, and deport immigrants. Within this infrastructure, we saw the increase in racial profiling, greater policing of black and brown communities, enhanced militarization of the US-Mexico border, and the implementation of racist federal policies such as the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, which targeted immigrants from 25 countries. Among the thousands who were affected by the post-9/11 regime were Kamal Sahib and Walter Barrientos in New York, and Marie Gonzalez in Missouri, 3 young, undocumented immigrants who were threatened with deportation. This is a term that gets used regularly. I want to take another brief tangent to talk about it. Threatened with deportation is the accurate term, but I don't think that especially white folks understand, or you know, people who are not immigrants very much don't understand that language. It's not just like a legal consequence that is hanging out there. It is a constant thing that they are constantly reminded of, and creates a perpetual state of anxiety. There was someone in this channel who was an immigrant. Was it Shy? I don't remember who they were. It was one of those two, Sly or Shy. And they talked about how they would lose sleep at night. They would, especially coming up to the month where their visa would be under review, and every bit of paperwork they ever had to file, they constantly felt this very real threat, like a gun to their head. It's not just a thing where if they step out of line, they could face deportation, like if they get caught about it. It is a thing that is perpetually reinforced. It is an active threat that is visited upon them. It would be like if you had someone who called you up once a year, you know, or 2 times a year, or whatever, and when they called you, they would tell you if you got to keep your house and everything you possessed or not, and you would never know. For very arbitrary reasons. Not a great feeling. But yeah, I wanted to pause on that language because, yeah. Chat looked like it refreshed to me. I'm not sure. Just making sure that it still works. Anyway, their deportation cases spurred some of our first advocacy efforts that would eventually carry us forward in later forming UWD, United We Dream. Stuck on that. In 2008. Yeah, I'm not sure what's... Twitch is just acting weird tonight. It's fine. Our first advocacy efforts that would eventually carry us forward in later forming United We Dream into. Together, along with activists and organizers from across the country, we mobilized people to write letters and telephone elected officials to demand that the government allow Kamal, Walter, and Marie to stay in the United States, winning extensive media attention. Although Marie's parents were deported, organizing efforts stopped the deportations of Marie, Walter, and Kamal. This was a bittersweet moment in our fight to protect immigrants, as it further exposed the human impact of the enforcement regime in not only deporting immigrants, but also tearing apart families. This is another part of the human cost, is when families get partially deported and like children might be left here. Then we start getting organizations like ICE or whoever telling both parties involved they don't want anything to do with each other. We also talked about that in how the same tactics were used to separate indigenous children from their families. A lot of that is to separate them from their culture and erase that. Yeah, it stops them from building communities. It's an attempt to erase cultures. Yeah. And then subtracting a familiar resource. Absolutely. But yeah, like there's a lot of pillars in place to try and erase any culture except, you know, what's considered white American culture, and the hell that is. There's a lot of outcry from some on the right about needing to defend the American way of life. You know, I don't want to give that too much air, but like, none of them have actually been through cultural erasure, and this is what it looks like. These are the tools of destroying a culture. This moment also taught us that people closest to the pain are closest to the solutions our communities need. At the time, undocumented immigrants publicly fighting against deportations were unheard of. Yet, in defiance of conventional wisdom, undocumented youth and their families launched campaigns to share their stories, pressure those with decision-making power, and win deportation relief. It was clear that our movement had the power to create real change. This was even more evident in 2012, when the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals (DACA) program was created as a direct result of our organizing efforts. Under the Obama administration, enforcement programs and collaboration between ICE and local police were aggressively expanded, leading to an increase in the number of immigrants being detained and deported even for minor violations, such as traffic infractions. Under the political calculation that ramping up enforcement would bring members of Congress from both parties to the negotiating table, the Obama administration deported a record number of immigrants from the United States. During Obama's 8 years in office, more than 3 million individuals and families were deported and separated from their loved ones. His administration failed to pass legislative immigration reforms, while the enforcement regime steadily grew in resources and power. This is one of the biggest areas that I criticize Obama for. He was extremely naive in believing that capitulating to demands from conservatives would bring them to negotiate in good faith towards any kind of compromise. If there is any credit I will give conservative politicians, it is that they have and they act on their convictions. They're terrible convictions, but they don't compromise them. And the sooner any Democrats learn that, the better, because that's the way of it. Vast majority of them are true believers in regressive policy, and you can't work with that. And you can't give in to evil demand on the hopes that they will, back some good. It just doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened. At the moment, the main holdout, is like Joe Manchin on that front, who still seems to believe that he can negotiate with folks like me. But there's a lot of Democrats who still believes in giving the right what they want when what they want is like in something like this. What is being asked for is just objectively harmful and cruel. And you can't just say, well, we'll meet you halfway and be a little bit harmful and cruel. You're still being harmful and cruel to families. Like, there's no other way to cut that. As organizers and directly affected people, we recognized this as a moment of leverage. By sharing our stories, we could pressure President Obama to take action. Our movement successfully created the conditions that led President Obama to implement DACA, which protected close to 800,000 young immigrants from deportation. DACA, just as an aside, was not a legislative victory. It was not actually a law that got passed. It was an executive action. That's why it is such a fragile framework that Trump was able to fuck around with. The program continues to be the most significant policy breakthrough and victory on immigration in almost 3 decades. By sharing our stories and leading direct action and civil disobedience to get ICE agents out of our communities, we recognized the power we had in winning protection from deportation through policy changes. Direct action and civil disobedience. One of the biggest criticisms that liberals make is that when protests get a bit rowdy, they get a little concerned. And they're like, oh, well, you know, protests needs to be all peaceful and law-abiding. 800,000 immigrants earned protection under DACA because people got a bit rowdy. So sometimes you do have to break a few windows, and sometimes you do have to break the law in order to actually affect change. Take that how you will. Apologize, Twitch, on the TOS, but it has to be said. Like, historically, that's just how it is. Right. Yeah. Exactly, Humster. But, like, real pressure for change only happens when the volume gets loud enough. Because people don't listen otherwise. If change happened when people were just very peacefully and orderly demonstrating, there would not be need to push things further, but change doesn't happen. But the demand is still there. So there's only one step left. Raise the volume. I definitely, I stand with protesters, you know, like straight up. I wanted to pause on that one again because it has to be said every time. This and other victories have strengthened our movement and brought hope to our communities. But as we've seen, mass detention and deportation have not stopped. ICE and U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, the two agencies primarily responsible for immigration enforcement, have continued to carry out a racist and white supremacist agenda, targeting immigrants, particularly black and brown immigrants, for detention and deportation with little oversight or accountability. Clearly, our fight is not over. Year after year, failure at the immigration policy negotiation table has been followed by near silent acceptance of growing annual budgets and authority for ICE and CBP. Together, these two agencies employ more than 80,000 people, a massive budget of $25.3 billion in 2020, which is more than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. Yet, While resources for the deportation force have grown, schools and hospitals in our communities often remain underfunded and suffer from a lack of federal support. Now, let's talk finances a little bit. $25.3 billion. That can go a long way if the political will were there towards educating and finding jobs and providing housing for the 110 million or so undocumented immigrants who are in this country. They could be made citizens. They could be made tax-paying citizens and very quickly pulled off of any sort of need for support. Actually, most of them don't need any support whatsoever today. Most of them are making ends meet on a shoestring, but still doing it. And we could recoup that $25 billion annually and put it into schools, hospitals, housing, food security. $25 billion is not a small number. It is not a small number. That is a lot of dollars. And I'll also point out that when these two organizations are expanding their budget year after year, where are the calls about how are we going to pay for it? There aren't. Somehow, when it comes to wielding a cudgel against marginalized communities, there's always money to be found. It would cost vastly less to just reach out, embrace them, bring them into the fold of all of American society, actually be the melting pot country. To uplift everyone who wanted an opportunity here. It would cost way less to do that. And as a benefit, they would be less likely to be in a destitute situation. And as we've talked about over and over again, those who are not destitute, way less likely to have to fall into anything resembling crime. It bears saying that immigrants, by and large, are way less likely to be criminal than native. Native is the wrong word, but natural-born citizens? Natural-born citizens, that's the word. But even so, like that is the way that you address that. You get people into a situation where they are financially secure, where they have housing security, where they have access to health, education, mental health, where they have access to food security. And these sorts of things, they wouldn't just have to be aimed at the undocumented. That $25 billion, if we didn't have this obsession with keeping people out, whatever, that would benefit everyone. That could go towards benefiting everyone. Because if you improve schools, hospitals, etc., those aren't just going to be for those undocumented. They're going to be for everyone. There are no downsides except the aforementioned corporations don't have access to effectively slave labor that they can dispose of. Yeah, it is super hard. It is, but That's why I like to pause and talk the finances a little bit. You could do a lot to break these numbers down and show it from just a pure numbers perspective, and that can be convincing to the apolitical and liberal-minded. It's really hard to break through to those who have hardened themselves against immigration. Right. Yeah. Agreed. The deportation force of ICE and CBP, built by administrations on both sides of the aisle, has been completely unleashed under the Trump administration. ICE and CBP have carried out a list of attacks against immigrant communities, including putting children in cages, targeting immigrants in their workplaces, schools, places of worship, hospitals, and homes, breaking down doors and abducting parents from their children. But the Trump administration hasn't stopped there. As a reminder, these essays were written in 2020 while Trump was still in office. Just to give that. Throughout his 4 years in office, Trump consistently tried to dismantle DACA, reduce refugee programs, and detain and deport an increasing number of immigrants. Under his administration, we have seen 57 immigrants, including children, die in detention camps. The deportation of a woman who served as a key witness in reports of sexual assault and harassment inside ICE facilities, which meant she could not be that witness. Reports of forced hysterectomies being performed on immigrant women, something that we previously covered. And 8 immigrants who have died as a result of COVID-19 while in ICE custody, a figure which has increased drastically since this was written. Facing these and a number of other attacks, United We Dream has fought tirelessly to protect and demand justice for immigrant communities. Over the past decade, UWD alone fought on behalf of more than 1,000 people threatened by deportation. Facing hundreds of calls per week on our community MicroWatch free hotline, United We Dream community organizers responded to immigrant families reporting interactions with ICE and CBP agents and needing help when their friends and loved ones faced detention and deportation. In one instance, Tanya, a cancer survivor in Georgia, was taken to a detention camp after a traffic stop. ICE agents kept Tanya locked away for 4 months, away from her children and the cancer treatment she needed to live. UWD has fought on behalf of individuals like Hector, who was taken away after being stopped for expired tags on his license plate, and high school students like Dennis, who were dragged away by ICE agents after reporting being bullied at school. Our history and the present moment have shown us that the risk of harm, detention, and deportation will always exist. Yeah, it's intensely awful. Because those systems they have no mechanism to consider human cost. And there's a series called Immigration Nation. It's a really hard watch. I think that's the title of it. But it kind of walks through the bureaucracy of it and how everyone kind of self-justifies whatever their piece is, but they don't see the whole big picture. And that's part of the problem with some of these massive bureaucratic institutions. And like, at least like they can't conceive of what the harm is that they're doing because they see their one cog in it. And they're trying in many cases, to do what they can. Yeah. As a system, it is a machine that just crushes families. And it doesn't matter how many people who are in the system try to do good by the system, they can't, because the system has no place for that. As a result, it tends to weed out those who are trying to do any sort of good. But even those who stay, they can't actually accomplish that, because there's no room for it. Yeah. And I'm not trying to say that to like build up any sympathy for ICE, individual ICE agents. But again, a lot of what I try to do is understand the machinations of how this happened. Because like, if you just say this system is rotten just because it is inhabited by rotten people, the answer is replace the people, but that's not actually the case here, and it's not the case with policing. The problem is this system itself serves to cause harm rather than create any sort of community health or look into any individual. The system itself is going to create harm. You could populate ICE with entirely people who have benevolent intentions, and they don't have a mechanism to do benevolent things within the framework of ICE. The goal is wrong. That's why I like to pause and talk about that sort of thing too. I think it bears saying. Yeah. Rotation will always exist where police and front do. Our vision is for all people in this country, regardless of immigration status, to be able to live freely with full dignity and thrive. Something about doing life, liberty, and happiness. To get there, we must unite in the largest struggle against white supremacy and racism, which are rooted in interlocking systems of policing, mass incarceration, and immigration enforcement that, by design, target and further dehumanize immigrants, especially people of color. At the same time, we must also acknowledge the historic erasure of black and indigenous people from immigration conversations and center these communities in our fight for immigrant justice. The United States' legacy of genocide and colonialism cannot be ignored, as the impact of these continues to be felt today. We've seen indigenous immigrants die as a direct result of the U.S. immigration system's failure to provide interpretation and translation services to immigrants who speak indigenous languages. In 2018, two children from indigenous Maya communities in Guatemala died in CBP custody after not receiving proper medical attention, as medical services were not translated in Quechua and Chuj, the two indigenous languages that the children and their families spoke. This is why, over the past decade, UWD leaders have made the demand of abolition and justice for all central to our vision, work, and movement strategy. Grounded in our lived experience, we know that ICE and local police work together to racially profile immigrants. For many in our communities, a traffic stop or any other contact with local police is the first entry point into the deportation pipeline. Thus, when we call for the abolition of ICE, we are also calling for the abolition of enforcement on all levels and the systems that support it, from detention facilities to prisons. The abolition of ICE is inherently tied to the abolition of all other forms of enforcement and incarceration. Hence, United We Dreams stands unequivocally with the movement for Black Lives and its demands to defund the police, because we know that the police, ICE, and CBP work together to disproportionately target black and brown immigrants. We also know that the same people who profit from the mass incarceration of United States-born black and brown people also profit from immigrant detention and deportation. We are engaged in a lifelong journey towards racial, gender, and economic justice. With each victory, our sense of what is possible should grow, and our understanding of the vulnerabilities of our adversaries should deepen. A world where our communities do not have to live with the fear of deportation and detention is possible. A world in which we and others in the movement have abolished ICE, and where the safety, health, education, and well-being of our communities is a priority. We have witnessed and participated in a movement of undocumented people who have transformed the politics and policy of immigration with a bold vision of freedom and dignity for all people, regardless of immigration status. That movement has proven that when we follow the leadership and vision of those closest to the pain and injustice, a new world is possible. So it does write a little blurb about them. I should have looked here. Cynthia Garcia is an out queer undocumented woman living in Oklahoma City. This is probably why I couldn't read anything about her when I couldn't Google about her, because she is undocumented. So she probably does not want to have a real big digital footprint. Gosh. She serves as the National Campaigns Manager for Community Protection at United We Dream, where she runs a nationwide hotline for support of immigrants whose family members have been abducted by ICE agents. Teaches them how to organize and fight back. Cynthia is herself protected from deportation because of the DACA program. Cristina Moreta, community organizer, strategist, and freedom fighter, a co-founder of United We Dream, migrated to Queens, New York from Ecuador at the age of 13, seeking a better life, and grew up undocumented. Former executive director of UWD, under her leadership, grew into a powerful grassroots network of 800,000 members across 28 states. And yeah, if you want to support United We Dreams, I encourage that. United We Dream. Again, that's that URL. Good essay. Very good essay. It is important to recognize how all of these systems interlock and how all of them are designed organically to absolve any one organization of, the guilt and the human cost of what they do. It's a massive machinery that destroys people, and it has to be dismantled at a systemic level. It's not something that any particular individual, like police chief or department head, can resolve. An apparatus has to be built with the goals of community health and well-being in mind. And that is the call for police abolition. Like, that's the abolitionist perspective. As a closing note, as I always say in these segments, this is the 12th essay in 30 of the Abolition for the People series. This is a series of essays organized by Hyperneck Publishing, of advocates, activists, lawyers, scholars, and people with lived experience, making the case for police abolition from various perspectives. We're trying to cover one of these per week. Won't stop until we get through all of them. So that note, gonna close this segment and shift over just chat.